Well, it's 7:01. I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. I will do a little bit of an introduction so that as folks are joining in, they won't miss too much of what Gretchen Greene has to say. Well, welcome everybody to our webinar on ecosystem services. My name is Maya Swope, and I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District. Looking at the names on the attendee list, I think a lot of you are familiar with the work that we do. But for anyone who doesn't know us, we are a local government unit based in the Southwest metro area of the Twin Cities. And we're working to protect, manage, and restore the water resources there. So we're really excited to have Gretchen Greene here to give a presentation on ecosystem services. A few things that I wanted to make sure everyone knows just about the Zoom technology before we get started. The first one you've probably seen, you can use the chat function. There's a little button that should be either on the bottom of your screen or else on the right-hand side. So if you have commentary or things that you want to discuss, you can feel free to add that into the chat. Also, if you're having any technical issues, you can send a chat directly to me, and I can try to help you figure out any sound or other technical issues that you might be having. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, I would ask that you put them in the Q&A box, which is also located on the bottom of your screen. That'll let, it'll allow us to collect all of the questions in the same place. Also, you can upvote other questions. So if somebody else asks a question that you think is important and you want to make sure that gets asked, you can vote on that one and it'll rise to the top. What else do I need to talk to you about? Yeah, feel free to message me about any issues or concerns. At some point in the presentation, you'll see a poll pop up. So there's a polling feature at the bottom of the screen as well. And we will mention when that will pop up, but yeah, you'll be asked to fill out just a very brief question there. I think that's all of the things I had to say related to Zoom. So I'm going to turn it over to Gretchen Greene, who is an economist with Greene Economics, and we're really excited to have her talk about ecosystem services. So I will let her introduce herself a little bit more.
Thank you very much, Maya. Thank you to everyone for coming out this evening and taking some time away, perhaps from your families and perhaps from enjoying some of the ecosystem services in your area. And if you don't know what I mean by that, I'm hoping that at the end of the hour or whatever, you will have a better idea. So my name is Gretchen Greene, and I'm an environmental economist with Greene Economics. I have two other equal partners, but I kind of had the best name for the company since we're all environmental economists. And we specialize in bringing the value of environmental quality into our economic decision making. And ecosystem services has a lot to do with that. So when Claire asked me to come and talk, I said I would be delighted to, as this is one of my favorite topics. I'm also going to try to just kind of throw out a lot of ideas, and I look forward to discussion. I don't know really how much people know or don't know, but this is my take on the whole topic, and I look forward to discussion and questions along the way. So let's see. I want to change the slide. That would be, there we go. So loosely organized around what are ecosystem services, providing a little background and history of the ecosystem services framework, and then explaining how the framework is used and giving a few examples, and then talking about some places where you can learn more if you're interested, and then we will open it up for questions. So with that, I'll start off with the definition. Oh, or this is just a header slide to talk about the definition. What are ecosystem services? I'm going to cover the definition, the key services, some of the key services, who's interested, advantages, what's new here, if anything. It's kind of a lot of the similar things that I'm sure you've all studied and heard about before, but maybe with new packaging. and talk about why is everyone talking about it. So there's the definition. The definition of ecosystem services is just the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. And so that was determined by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005. And that was kind of the formal birth culmination of a lot of movement in this direction. And we'll do a little bit of the history behind that. But the concept here is that we benefit from our natural environment. And the point of the whole exercise is to be able to quantify and help bring that those benefits, the value of those benefits, into our decision making so we can manage for optimal outcomes. Some good examples are clean water for drinking and bathing, recreation. Just thinking maybe somebody might have been out recreating earlier this evening. Habitat for other species. I said other there, meaning not ourselves. We're ones we've known about and looked at some value for that for a long time. So that's a market-based piece. This is one way that you might organize or think about all these different kinds of ecosystem services. And we're going to look at a couple other typologies, if you will, about this. So I'm not too hung up on the different categories. I just want to expose the group to some of the common ones. This one was put together by the CGIR, which is an international research organization, in their Water and Land page. But you can see that some of the services are pollination, for example. That's a service that's kind of outside of our market transactions, but it's very important to agriculture, for example. Pest and disease management, freshwater, food, fiber, habitat, and genetic resources. Just kind of slipped food in there, but that's a big ecosystem service that the habitat and the land provide for us, that we're able to produce food. Recreation and tourism, then spiritual health and cultural identity. I suspect everyone on this call has a lot of cultural value for the natural environment. Then there's things like erosion prevention. That's a service that good stream banks can provide. And absent that, when we lose the strong stream banks and start to experience erosion, that's when we realize, oh, it's valuable what we had. Protection from natural disasters, that has come into play a lot more recently. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Carbon sequestration and carbon storage, that's another regulating service. Air and water pollution control, nutrient cycling, and soil fertility. And so that's just one way to think about it. So this is a poll question, and I'd like you to answer this. And when a bunch of people have answered it, I should be able to see the results. So if you can find that, the question is just simply, which of these ecosystem services most interests you? You're most interested in learning about or studying or thinking about how you can get this ecosystem service better managed in the Riley Purgatory, oh no, I can't say it, Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed. I don't know too much about the Watershed district, unfortunately, but I've learned a little bit. Okay, so I can see those. Water quality is a big one. Is big. Habitat is big. And oops. Oh, can you all see the poll results on my screen? I'm not really sure.
So I just shared them with everybody. So anyone who clicks on the polling little tab on the bottom should be able to see them. And you can let me know in the comments if you can't.
Okay. And wetlands, I wonder if that one's colored orange because it's the most popular. Could be. Also, just before we go on, I think I need to, oh, there we go. All right, well, that is really good. That gives me a sense of what you're interested in. And I'm sure a lot of you are interested in recreation, but I'm interpreting this as that that you're interested in learning more about how the ecosystem services framework could be helpful in some of those areas. Okay, so who is interested in this approach? Private landowners are interested in this approach. So people are starting to realize, well, their property may have some values that they didn't consider before. There may be water running through it. There may be trees that are of value. There may be habitat, etc. And so private landowners are interested in being able to make sure that they capture the value of their property, or at least understand and plan for it. Public landowners, the same thing. It's a way to conduct your efficient environmental management and a way to monitor and help protect and preserve your natural assets. Governments, as stewards of the public resources such as air and water and natural processes, for which we don't really have so much ownership. So the public is, governments are stewards of that. And so this approach can help quantify things that are trickier to get at. International organizations the same way are overseeing coordination of global ecosystem services, such as air travels around the globe, and a lot of the oceans and the fisheries, et cetera, need cooperative management internationally. Then environmental groups see it as a means of bringing structure and enforcement into some of the environmental regulations, and that we've seen a lot of that. But also corporations and industries are interested in this approach because it helps them build on their corporate social responsibility. So there's more and more voluntary and mandated reporting, but they also like it because it helps them brand in their branding and sort of build the license to operate in local communities. So we're seeing more and more involvement at the corporate level too. The potential advantages of using this approach include for public planning, just to think ahead and be able to determine what's the appropriate investment in protecting our environmental resources and how do we monitor and plan and keep track of that. Preventing damage and degradation, measuring an environmental asset it helps you know what you have, and then if there's degradation, you can know when that is degraded. I think about if you experienced a robbery in your home and the police came and said, okay, what did they steal? And you said, well, I don't know. It was a whole bunch of stuff, but it was really valuable. I mean, that doesn't do so much for you as if you say, well, I had these 3 cars and I had some jewelry and some artwork, et cetera, and this is the dollar values of those. At least identifying what items you had is important to prevent, in this case, maybe to prevent the loss, but also so that if there is a loss, you know what you've lost, which without, in many of the environmental areas, we don't understand what we've lost. Taking stock, that's kind of a related concept, estimating the values for an entire natural capital stock. There's a lot of environmental accounting that's going on or that people are talking about. How do we keep track of the gains and losses in the environment? We think about the system of national accounts. We keep track of our GDP. There's all kinds of new systems where we're trying to keep track of the natural capital that we have. And that phrase natural capital, you can think about the capital is the solid asset like an investment, and then the flow, the environmental services, the ecosystem services are the return on that asset. So you have to keep track of both, but the value of the whole stock is both the stock and the present value of the future flow of those services. I toss that out in hopes that accounting folks or people who are involved in valuing, for example, a business is the same way. The value of the business is the value of the stock of capital plus the value of the future stream of profits from that business. Okay, creating markets is another potential advantage of the ecosystem services approach. So once we quantify an environmental good or service, we can bring markets into it, and we can bring the advantages of markets, which if you have competitive markets, you can achieve some efficiency in the distribution and achieve some lower costs in provision of those goods and services. So we can bring the advantages of markets in some of these cases. Creating certainty is important. Environmental regulation moves around a lot, and ecosystem services is potentially a way to help provide certainty in environmental regulation. And what we found is that ecosystem services helps force you to define and quantify explicitly the types of goals in environmental management. And that common language is often very favorable for environmental disputes because you're getting down to the details. Also, in certain cases, ecosystem services can be a way to generate revenue for ongoing protection of the resources. Okay, so I can't quite read my, I think it says what's new here. What's new here? So many of the people on the call probably have been involved in environmental management and protection for a long time. And so you have been thinking about water quantity, and we measure ecosystem services in the same types of metrics, acre feet per year, cubic foot per second for water quantity are just some examples. Water quality and total dissolved solids, or parts per million, or TMDLs. So carbon, we think of metric tons of carbon equivalent as the most common unit to think about greenhouse gases. Recreation, we talk about visitor days. And habitats, not a lot of people are as familiar with this phrase, but we use it quite a bit. Service acre years. So it's the services of one pristine acre of a certain habitat type for 1 year. And that's a metric that we can use. So since these are similar metrics, you know, what's new about the ecosystem services approach? Oh, yes, and also some dollars. Dollars are, or monetary units are some metrics that we use. Well, the only thing that's new is an emphasis. It's focusing on the flow of services. As much as possible, quantify specific units per year is most common, but we can think about it in per day, or any kind of period of time will work. So what's new here, it's really a broad framework that we're talking about that's just kind of helping to focus. The ecosystem services is kind of an umbrella that's brought together a lot of different concepts, and I'm hoping to go over a lot of those. Why is everyone talking about it? Well, it is a formal approach for defining the service flow, keeping track of environmental gains and losses, informing our decision-making, and understanding and capturing that value of these ecosystem services. As I said, it's a broad framework and it's used in different ways, but I think in my mind, it's simply put the broad, at the most basic sense, is measure, quantify, and then monitor. Okay, so that was the whole introduction to what are ecosystem services. Now we're going to do a little bit of a quick background and history. So talking about first kind of the history of how this blends in with some of our the original environmental movement in the 70s, and then how economics fits in, and then looking at the newer Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework. So you think about the Clean Water Act in the 70s, we go back to Silent Spring and our dramatic awareness that occurred, at least in this country at that time. Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, and what that says is that, well, in part of it says is that we need to make the improvements which are necessary to conserve such waters for the protection and propagation of fish and aquatic life and wildlife, recreation, and the withdrawal of such waters for public supply, agriculture, and industrial purposes, which has been shortened. A lot of people refer to this as the notion that the Clean Water Act commands us to preserve waters so that they are fishable, swimmable, and potable. Well, those sound like the benefits of the waters, the benefits to people, so that we can fish, so that we can swim, and so that we can drink those waters. Now, turning to the economic perspective, so I started studying this in the late 70s and early 80s, and continue to this day. But at that time, environmental economics wasn't using the phrase ecosystem services. It's evolved over time. But we started by thinking about, well, environmental economists, as I mentioned, we like to think about the efficiency of markets and how do we distribute goods and services. And natural resources or environmental assets are a little different, primarily because, and we call it market failure. So we don't get all the benefits that you get from a market, and it's very challenging to do that. Some of the reasons is that they're public goods, meaning that they are provided publicly, and so they know there's no property rights, and so it's difficult to think about ownership and benefits of ownership. In economics, we're always thinking that if you own something, you will take care of it to the extent that that suits your needs. Now, if the public owns it, what are the needs, and how are you taking care of it, and who's taking care of it? That's all a little bit messier and more confusing. Another reason there's market failure is, as I mentioned, just challenging to measure. The free rider problem comes up because if the public is providing the good example in economics is, you think of national defense. We pay and we have this big national defense. And if you don't pay your taxes, there's no way to exclude you from enjoying the benefits of national defense. In the same way that, so there, you have every incentive to take advantage of all of these goods, even if you don't pay in. That's the free rider problem. And also, we just tend to take things for granted if we haven't lost them. So I have this quote from an article. Unfortunately, watershed protection efforts are often only undertaken in response to watershed degradation. You don't miss the water until the well runs dry. So it's kind of an unusual, environmental assets or ecosystem services are unusual. And what tends to happen if in this market failure context is that nobody's taking care of the asset, and it will naturally decline and degrade. And we've seen extinction of species and all kinds of degradation of our environment because we weren't taking care of it. So, so in economics, we started thinking about, okay, well, some environmental attributes have market values. I mentioned the timber. Commercial fishing is another ecosystem service for which there's a market. We enjoy the benefit of the fish and we go sell it. So we know what that is worth. Agriculture the same way. But as we started thinking about environmental economics, we classified them in a slightly different way. We talked about non-market values. Okay, the society values environmental benefits from the natural environment in different ways. So we call these non-market values. So those were categorized into direct use. You directly enjoy the natural environment through recreation, or you maybe are studying it, or your subsistence, you're gathering mushrooms or hunting and fishing and using that for subsistence. So those were all direct uses. Then other uses are indirect, such as habitat or flood protection. So if you like to hunt deer, the deer habitat, the quality of the deer habitat indirectly affects your enjoyment of hunting deer. Same thing for flood protection, is that, as I mentioned before, like stable stream banks protect our own assets, the built environment, from flood. So the stream banks aren't the actual direct benefit, but they indirectly support the benefit of not experiencing flooding. Then there's passive use values, which gets at the fact that we love nature when we care about, there are religious and cultural and just values for the existence, or maybe we want the option. We would like to know that the Everglades are in good shape because I might want to visit there and do some recreation, or I just believe that they have a right to be in their natural state, or I want the option in the future for my children. So that's the way we categorize non-market values. That language has fallen away in light of the ecosystem services language now, which is fine. And then I want to just put over here in the markets, now we're seeing more and more ecosystem service markets. I would include in this wetland banks, which have been around for a while, but now they would fall in this rubric as ecosystem service markets. Wetland banks, carbon markets, water quality trading, air quality markets. Again, these have been around for a while, but we would call these ecosystem service markets now. So this is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which came out in 2005. And this is, for better or for worse, this way to categorize all of the different services. Let's see what my time looks like. Okay. It's not perfect, but just think it's worthwhile to point it out. And a lot of systems are using this format now. Provisioning services in the upper left, that's where your food and your water and your wood and your fiber and your subsistence, and your fishing, that's all provisioning. It's kind of like the direct use, but that I think about as an economist, but not exactly. It's providing things that are provided by the natural environment. Supporting services are kind of like those indirect ones I was just talking about, habitat and soil formation and nutrient cycling. Then regulating services, again, the supporting and the regulating, there's overlap. There's a lot of overlap in this business. I don't want to give the impression that anything is really carved in stone, but this framework is quite widely used. Regulating services, I think this came up because of climate regulation. Again, that was an asset. The ozone was an asset that we didn't really monitor or pay too much attention to before. And so now we realize, oh, that's regulating our climate. Flood regulation, I mentioned the stream banks and also dunes, for example, along the coast. Natural dunes can regulate against storms and flood. Water purification, the floodplains are served to purify the water. And so those regulating services, we want to take account of that. And then cultural services, that's where the spiritual and aesthetic, but also the educational and the recreational fall in that. So in the economics mindset I just showed you, the recreation would be in the direct use. But anyway, it doesn't really matter how you break it down. This is the most common framework in use now. And then just another document that you might want to check out sometime in 2011, the Obama administration produced this report, Sustaining Environmental Capital, Protecting Society and the Economy. Again, that's just a reminder that this is economics and ecology coming together in this framework. I put this up here because the supporting services are kind of hard to see sometimes, but we did some work with the shellfish aquaculture industry here in Washington, and they have been trying to get credit for the fact that shellfish, well, maybe this isn't going to work. Oh, shoot. The shellfish clean up the environment. And this, oh, my video isn't working. Darn it. If later on, if anyone wants to see it, they use this trying to advocate for the case that the shellfish clean up the nutrients, and so their they have a benefit to water quality, and they use this with the Washington State Legislature. Just it was over half an hour, and if the video goes, you can see that left side stays brown, and with the bag of manila clams in it, it just slowly gets completely clear, that water. Darn it. Don't know why that didn't work, but okay. How is this framework used now? There's a lot of overlap again here between markets and payments for ecosystem services, different regulations, and compensating and offsetting for losses. So those are just some different ideas. As I said, they kind of overlap, but I wanted to make it clear that the framework is applied to quantifying, measuring. You don't have to include monetary units. You can just stick with environmental units. It doesn't have to be a market. There's all kinds of different structures. So we'll just look at a few of those in some examples. First of all, markets, this little graphic shows how ecosystem markets initiatives have grown since 1985. You can see going through till 2015. Well, it looks like there's a lot here in Minnesota. And this doesn't include the air markets, the cap and trade like in California and some of the other areas, or the voluntary carbon markets. This is just, it's probably hard to see, but the orange dots are forest and land use carbon. The blue dots are watershed. The purple dots are wetlands and streams. So there's some mechanisms for wetlands and streams at work here in Minnesota. I'm not familiar with them. And then the yellow are the multiple asset types. So there's lots of different structures for habitat banking, wetland offsets that have been in place for a long time. They basically allow for trading to exist between different entities who are interested in having access to the natural environment. In the cap and trade, the emissions, people want to emit gases, greenhouse gases, and so the government decides just how many emissions can be there, and then the different entities that want to emit can trade for the right to emit into the natural environment. Same thing for water quality markets, and also water rights is water quantity markets, and habitat banking occurs in lots of development contexts, so that developers who might take some habitat can get credit in a habitat bank, and the same thing for wetlands. And there's just the USDA office of has a web page here that says understanding environmental markets, so lots more information. They have water quality markets, carbon markets, biodiversity and habitat, and then payment for ecosystem services is the next sort of structure we're going to look at. So this one, you're just paying for the provision of the service. So there's not trading. You don't need to trade. You just whoever's interested in that service is paying for it. A friend of mine has one that she operates in Haiti that pays the farmers to maintain the trees along the stream banks to prevent the erosion. And then the farmers are paid per tree. And that's a very interesting program. An example here is one that I worked on for the Carson River watershed. They wanted to pay farmers for floodplain preservation, and they wanted to know how much should we pay them. And they wanted to encourage the farmers not to develop, because if the farmers sold out to developers, then they'd lose the floodplain. So we did some analysis and simulated flooding with development and realized that, and then we estimated the water quantity, how much water attenuated into the aquifer as a result of having the floodplain, how much the floodplain reduced the speed of a peak flood event, reduce the volume of the flood to the downstream, and increase the warning time because it was slower and smaller volume. So for one peak event, for example, we learned that 5 acre-feet of water attenuated during that peak event. The flow was reduced by 100 CFS, and you got 1 to 2 or more hours of warning time for the downstream town. And we ended up saying, well, somewhere between $300 and $1,900 per year per acre for the farmers. That's payment for ecosystem services. Another sort of category of things is to think about regulatory responses. And I've got a list of regulations where there's ecosystem services responses. I'm not going to go through all of those, but just looking at the carbon tax here, for example, that's not a market. You're not setting up a market for ecosystem services. It is a market-based mechanism, but it's bringing the value of that, of the carbon greenhouse gas warming potential into the economy. So that's different regulatory responses. This I pulled out and I found, I don't know too much about it, but I don't know if it came into being, but at one point the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency was concerned that there was going to be a TMDL on the Minnesota River. And so they got set up to have a phosphorus trading, again, for the right to release phosphorus into the river. Again, then the Pollution Control Agency would set the amount and let everyone trade. I don't know what happened to that, or if it came into being. I'm kind of interested, but that was in response to a TMDL regulation. And it was a market. Other regulatory response is just, here is a strategy called habitat equivalency analysis, and it evolved from natural resource damage assessment litigation. So when there's a big oil spill and the public needs to be compensated for the lost environmental ecosystem services, then we use this habitat equivalency analysis, and you can look at different options. In this case, there are all these different habitats, and you can look at a couple of different options for a project. Option 1 is blue, and option 2 is green. So you can see how the unit there is discounted service acre years, or DSAs. And so then that brings it all into kind of a currency, and you can look at it through time. How many discounted service acre years are lost or gained by a restoration project, or lost by an environmental harm, release of some sort, a damage. Offsetting losses, this is kind of, I just threw this in here as an example, again, for environmental losses, this is an example of some work we did for a confidential indigenous group, and a road had been placed on their land, and they were in discussions trying to negotiate and be compensated for the losses. So they had a lot of traditional uses in their culture for that land, and we worked in mapped it all in a GIS system and surveyed the community members for how this had impacted their daily life. There was a lot of subsistence that went on at the time that the road went through. And then we developed monetary estimates for those services that were lost. And here you can just see these aren't the real numbers, but because they're still in negotiation, as I understand. But we put like community values. This is in the passive and non-market values, community values, subsistence values, and then lost income for the timber and for some other non-timber products. The lost income these are market-based losses from the land that was taken for the road. And then the subsistence value, we estimated that out for some total losses. So that's just another application of this framework. What challenges are there to using this approach? Some people don't like the idea of quantifying and turning nature into a commodity, so is there a downside to this? I'm interested and involved in this because I think that if we don't quantify and measure, then in economic decision making, we get a zero because we don't know the value of it. So even though it may not be perfect, I'm in favor of putting a value on it, but there's certainly an argument to be made that is difficult to quantify, which is the other challenge to using this approach. It's difficult. It's difficult to get people to agree, especially when starting up like a cap and trade system. It takes a long time, and often these market-based systems are really difficult to get started. Once they're started, they're great and they really work well. But ecosystem services in general is a broad approach. It requires expertise in ecology and understanding regulations and economics. So it requires some interdisciplinary cooperation. And then sometimes there's the risk of doing more harm than good if you regulate. But there's ways around that if you're paying attention. So pop quiz here, just to see if anyone's still awake or listening. Which of the following is statements about ecosystem services is not true? First, ecosystem services may be measured in ecological units or in monetary units that represent value. B, commercial fishing is not considered an ecosystem service. C, sunlight is an ecological service. D, the ecosystem services framework is used by governments to protect the environment. So I'm going to watch this for a little bit. Let's see, I think I'm about done and we can, oh no, I have another section here. So I'm going to, this is a really important section. Maya, can everyone see the quiz on the pop quiz on my screen?
Yes, it looks like we've got 9 people have voted so far out of 17 that we've got logged in. So I'll give it a couple more minutes and then I can share the results of that.
Yeah, but can everyone see it now or can I go on? That's what I'm wondering.
You should
Can I go on or is it blocked?
Yeah, you should be able to go on and people can see it in a separate window on their own screen.
Okay. So just where to learn more. Yeah. Where to learn more, this is very important, okay. Nationally, some of the recommended sites are this USDA environmental markets, or it says at the top, but then it has this ecosystem services assessment portal, which is really cool. You can see the tabs there at the top are water quality, water quantity, carbon, wetlands, habitats. But then they have all these tools. This is, here's a list of assessment tools and mapping tools and guidance documents. And for each of those, you can search on this, and they have this pull down menu. For example, here you pull down and you can pick whether it's provisioning services, cultural, regulating, or general. And then this part of the pull down menu, you can see, you know, am I interested in carbon, cultural, general, habitat, health, products, risk, water. This part over here, am I looking for quantifying monetary outputs, non-monetary, or no qualification? So I think that's really nice, and I just wanted to show that it kind of reinforces some of the themes we have here. This was a Minnesota feature. I'm not too familiar with it, but I see they have a program where they're expanding pollinator habitat, and so they're paying participants annual credits of $75 for each half acre of pollinator, or $150 for the life of the contract, enhanced or new. So that's partnering with General Mills, that's getting some, probably some branding rewards there. And then, oh, another great resource for Minnesota is that Steve Pulaski is a professor of ecological and environmental economics at University of Minnesota. He's also one of the founders of the Natural Capital Project, which is a big ecosystem services research effort at Stanford. And so he has just been involved with ecosystem services for a very long time, and is a great resource. And then with that, I just would like to close with some, I mean, just to say that we talked about the definition of ecosystem services and the different ways to categorize. Oh, yay, so good. It was close there, that the answer is right. We got the right answer there on our poll. Commercial fishing is not considered an ecosystem service. That is false. Commercial fishing is. It's different because it's one of the market-based pieces. And sunlight, that was a trick because I hadn't really talked about sunlight, but I think that sun is certainly, sunlight and photosynthesis could certainly be considered an ecosystem service. So yeah, so just measure, quantify, monitor, ecology and economics work together. Nothing and everything is new with this approach, and there's lots of new opportunities. So with that, let's open it up for questions. I can't really, and I had some questions for you too. Does this make sense? Do you know of ecosystem service programs in this area, and what problems might there be with using this approach? So I'm going to go to the question box.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in for a second here. As we're answering questions, feel free to add any remaining questions into the Q&A box. You can also vote. There's a little like symbol, so you can like other people's questions if you think that they're particularly important and want to make sure that they get asked. I would say, I think maybe the easiest way, if you've got kind of an answer to this question that Gretchen posed up on the PowerPoint, that maybe we could do that through the chat.
Yeah, so the chat and question and answer, I can see the chat ones and I could answer those, but Maya, if there's some in the Q&A box, I might not have seen those, so maybe you can ask those.
Sure, yes. So I can start. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay, so I'm reading the chat. Don't forget to add any questions. That was from you. And then someone said, it's all new. Dorothy said, does she have any recommendations? So I did have those recommendations, I think some of those websites are fantastic. There's just, and also the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is an excellent place, and they've got great PowerPoints and all kinds of stuff. From Claire, how do you weigh the various variables? Is it dependent to the community or the resource? Really good. When you work with community and you quantify services, how do you bring consensus to the values utilized? Oh, great questions, Claire. So especially great question about the community, because the values differ wildly by community. Just as a case in point, I can tell you that people in Louisiana have a lot different feel about oil spills than people in Washington do, for example. So it's the community who's making the decision, and different communities have different values on different things. And you can, so I think the ecosystem services approach is very community specific in order to get all the benefits that I was talking about, to have the best management and make the best decisions. It's not helpful if you're trying to help a county make decisions about preserving their environment. And you say, well, some other county on the other side of the country says the environment, this aspect of this ecosystem service is really important. You're never going to get anywhere if the folks in that county feel that other priorities. So, and how do you bring consensus on the values utilized? That is just, in my experience, once you get to quantifying and talking about it and quantifying, and then working through looking at like monetary values, which you don't have to use. Sometimes you can just be dealing with trading in ecological values, but it's really the quantifying that helps bring consensus. But otherwise, just all of the tools that I use are very transparent. And so you can just look at, does this change the outcome? So people say, well, I think this is more important or that is more important. And then if you have your tools set up so that you can just change those and see, does that change my decision about what I'm going to do, what I'm going to invest in? So are any watersheds in our district currently using ecosystem services, our state? And that is a good question from Tim. Oh, I skipped. Let me answer Tim first. Apparently, yes. And unfortunately, I don't really know that much about them, but one of the documents, and this PowerPoint will be available for you to look at. One of the documents I was looking at was that the Forest Trends put out an ecosystem services atlas, ecosystem service markets atlas. And so there were a lot of dots in Minnesota. So unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to look into those too much. But and then also, I just want to mention too that I know that the school trust lands in Minnesota, does that sound familiar? They are looking into doing habitat banking and looking into the ecosystem services approach for managing those school trust lands, which are lands that have long been in trust and are managed to optimize the value, and the revenue goes to education. Louise asked, is this approach used internationally? Yes, widely. As a matter of fact, some fabulous literature is everywhere. Far better than what we have in the US, unfortunately, in this area. For a reason I don't fully understand, there's a lot of documentation and quantification of ecosystem services internationally that's done by like the development organizations, like that one that I cited, the CGIAR, which is International Agricultural Research System. They have ecosystem services, detailed reports documenting the ecosystem services and the values for those all over the world. So are there any questions? I don't, we may be out of time, but are there any questions in the Q&A that I didn't see?
Yeah, so
Maya?
I can read those off to you. I think that would probably be the easiest way to do that.
Okay.
The first one that I see here is from Barry, who asks, what do you think of the concept of monetizing ecosystem services to support further investments in ecosystem development? For example, selling carbon offsets to companies in pursuit of their net GRG goals.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess I'm wondering, that's part of the trade-offs that we're dealing with here. I'm wondering if he thinks that that's kind of a bad idea because we're maybe there are trade-offs. I don't know. I'm kind of reading between the lines there, but it sounds like a good. I'm in favor of quantifying and getting credits going, because otherwise I'm afraid, what's the option?
Mm-hmm.
The option is that we don't quantify, we don't pay attention, we don't take account of our ecosystem services, and they get degraded without, willy-nilly, and we're not monitoring and keeping track.
Thanks.
If you have
Yeah.
a follow-up, go ahead and take that, because I'm not sure, but maybe you can go on to the next one, Maya.
Yeah, so the next one that popped up is from Dorothy, who's asking, how can we use this in calculating losses of wetlands and in calculating flood storage?
Well, it's just a question of monitoring and keeping track and measuring. The wetlands are usually acre of wetland, and there are a lot of, I don't know what the system is here, but usually if you develop a wetland, you've got to take at least two, you've got to preserve and bank at least twice as many. I mean, that's what it is in many states. So that, I would call that already an ecosystem service process. We have regulations against losing wetlands already, but I guess it's an enforcement question perhaps. And the other one, floodplain values.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, so again, like I think I gave an example of the floodplain value where in Carson River, where they were paying to, anyway, or maybe a shorter answer would be floodplain values. There's a lot you get aquifer recharge, and so you're protecting your aquifers, and you get habitat, and you get you also get prevention from the flood. So the best way to look at the ecosystem service value is to look at the avoided damages. So that's kind of where that regulating category came. Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, they call it the regulating category, but a lot of times we're just trying to think about what are the damages and how do we avoid those. So same thing for like dunes and beach erosion. You're trying to preserve the system and give the system credit for the prevention of the harm. So it's a little kind of backwards. But flooding, there's all kinds of flood simulation, and if it floods, all these damages that happen. And so the benefits of floodplain preservation are avoiding the damages.
Mm-hmm. And along those lines, one question that I've had on my mind that I'll just throw in here because I think it relates to Dorothy's in terms of floods is just wondering what the conversation has looked like around climate change and ecosystem services, and if the framework, maybe it totally is encompassing and climate change just fits into that, or what that conversation looks like among economists and those working in the field.
I'm very glad you asked that. It's near and dear to my heart. I spend a lot of my time working in ecosystem services and climate change, and flooding is a really good example because not only do you have to forecast the floods and the damages with the flood, which we've been doing for a while, But now we need to forecast some kind of change, more flooding and more damages. So it's all in the forecasting. And when we think about investing in anything, in restoration or preservation, you have to think ahead, right, and do a forecast. So in all of the work that I do, I think pretty safe to say, we take into account a forecast that accounts for climate change and how things, we don't just look backwards and say what happened before. We have to be honest and say the forecast is changing.
Mhm.
There will be, at least in Washington, there will be more floods, for example. So there will be more rainfall and more floods.
Great. Yeah, and I think that's definitely true here as well. Moving on to the next question from Anne. Has monetizing ecosystem services ever been applied to the residential real estate market, if you know about that?
Well, yeah, that's a good question about applied. I don't know whether, I mean, the real estate market has its own drivers, and but a couple of different kinds of analysis. There's an analysis called, an approach that economists use called hedonic property values, where we look at all of the different real estate transactions within a given area and period of time and do a massive regression on them to see, well, did properties, all other things the same, that's the regression approach, all other things the same, so you've normalized for square foot and all the other, schools and whatever else, all other things the same, did having trees, for example, in the yard improve the property value? And so yes is the answer, in the different studies and different areas will say by how much. Did having water rights or a stream access change the property values? So I don't know if it's been applied to the real estate, but we've used the real estate property value transactions to estimate the value of trees, for example, or stream access.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Just reading the questions here. The next one I see is from Marilyn, asking, what about the physical and mental health benefits of nature, in parentheses, forest bathing and medicine developed from plants and microbes, and is that taken into account?
Yeah, I missed the middle, but I'll do the first and the last, and you can tell me what the middle one is.
Sure.
So more and more, I know that in the last decade, there's been a tremendous jump in estimating the value of the mental health benefits and the benefits of just access to nature, physical and mental, especially like in the, I remember because 15 years ago, I had a friend, she was depressed, and I said, jog outside, and she loved it. She said she felt so much better. And I remember looking at the literature and said, hasn't anybody measured this? Well, they hadn't 15 years ago. Now they have. They've measured a lot of, exercising outside versus exercising inside, and what is the mental health benefit of being outside. And there's other studies like that to just demonstrate that access to nature is valuable in terms of health. And then we can turn that into money, monetary. That's another, areas like the health, the cost of healthcare and the cost of morbidity and mortality. And so as economists, we roll that all in. And then the medicines too. There've been a lot of studies about medicines, and that's been used to estimate like the value of natural, like the rainforest. There've been a bunch of studies that looked at the value of the rainforest in terms of, it's so diverse that we don't know, so like what's the average chance that you're going to develop a medicine from an acre of a rainforest, and that's a way to kind of impute a monetary value through the value of the medicine. And then there was something in the middle there.
Let's see. Those were the main points. She had mentioned forest bathing, but I think that you kind of talked about that a little bit with the health benefits as well.
Okay.
So we've got 2 questions left. I think we can answer them really quickly here while we've got them up. So Terry is
Okay.
asking, how do you account for the fact that societal values change when quantifying ecosystem services?
Oh, that's a good point. And I appreciate you raising it, because I hadn't really thought about it. I spent a lot of time thinking about how different societies have different cultural values globally, and even, if you think about it, probably in wherever you live, there's several neighborhoods around, and they all probably have different kinds of values. But one thing I can say is that the market structures, when you do set up a market, then the market's going to take care of that, because you have a limited supply. And so if, for example, people start to value whatever the attribute is more, the market ought to adjust for that, more or less the price. If people have a change in demand for greenhouse gas emissions, for example, then if there's more demand for that, and people really want to, their values about greenhouse gas emissions go up, then the price will go up. So the market mechanism doesn't allow for some of that adjustment. But otherwise, I think it's a good question. I'm going to have to think about that.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, the last question I see here really quick. Ryan is asking, almost 15 years ago, I saw James Hansen propose flooding vast tracts in Canada and Russia to mitigate sea level rise. Are you familiar with any advancements in this proposal?
No, I've never heard of that, but it sounds very interesting. I'd love to learn more about it. And also, I think I'll just put up, there's my email and my contact information if anyone wants to follow up. And whoever asked that one, I'd certainly be curious about it. I've never heard about that.
Yeah, perfect.
To mitigate sea level rise, I see. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, that is all of the questions that we've got here. I will send out a follow-up email that has your contact info, as well as some of the resources that you pointed out. So for anyone on the call that is interested in learning more about that, you can look out for that in the next couple of days. I'll also send out just a very brief survey for everyone. We're still kind of new to running webinars like this, and want to make sure it is a platform that's working for everyone, and that if you have feedback about that, that we can hear that. So Gretchen, I just wanted to say thank you again for coming and giving this presentation. I know I've learned a lot throughout this past hour, and I think I've seen a lot of other staff in the attendee list. I think we've all learned a lot from this. So thank you again for coming. I really appreciate it. And then just to everybody else, look out for a follow-up email from me.
Thanks so much, Maya, and thanks for everyone for taking some time out to come and learn about this.
Great, thank you.